Welcome to the Django project, djblogger. This tutorial is part of a YouTube Django project playlist, which you can access in the video description. You can watch the whole course from the very beginning. If you enjoyed this course and would like all the updated tutorials and associated code samples and more, you can check out this course and other courses this project features at Udemy. The link to the course is in the video description. The next component, we're going to build the index or the homepage splash component. This splash screen component at the top here below the navbar, at the moment it just has some text and a button which doesn't necessarily click to anywhere, but later on in our project we might want to change this to navigate or allow the user to navigate to a popular component of our application. So let's get back into our application here. Just drop that down. So this is the navbar. Let's remove that, the main.css. Right, so back in djblogger, we have the blogs here. We have some templates, the template folder. You can see it's getting quite busy. So don't forget, we've got this option here where we can close all the folders, and then maybe that will help you then navigate to where you need to get to. So djblogger and then templates. So inside of our blog at the moment, we have the index page. Now what we can do here, if we prefer, is to make a separate component, and that component will be our splash screen or our splash component that we're going to add onto the home page. So what we might do here inside the blog, if it is specific to the blog app, we might make a new folder here. We might call it components. Now you can do whatever you like here in regards to organizing the content. I'm just trying to think logically here. If I'm going to build a component, an aspect of my application which is going to be utilized multiple times, I want to potentially make that into a small component, a reusable component, which I can include onto my templates as and when I need them. So in this case, the index splash screen probably isn't going to be utilized on any other page, but let's just make the assumption it is. And we go ahead and create a new page here. We'll just call this splash.html. So let's just remind ourselves of what we did previously here. We created a container. Remember, our container is containing this section of our website to a certain width. Remember, we utilized the container, we specified the maximum width. So if we're going to build another container underneath, we want to make sure that the container is potentially running or working at the correct size. So we are going to want to line this container that we're going to build with the old container. So let's get back into our code. Let's take a look at the previous container that we utilized. Now it's just a case of then following this back. So we went into the base and navbar. So before we created this container here, it looks like, and this container was containing our navbar to a certain width. So let's start off building this splash with a new div, and then we're going to have a class equals container. Okay. So let's just add something there. Let's go back to our page and refresh. And refresh. We haven't got the server turned on, so that isn't going to work. So let's try that again. Oh, it looks like we have got the server turned on. Okay, so we haven't actually imported it yet. That's why. Apologies. So now we have made our splash. Let's just connect this all up. So inside of our index page here, we want the navbar. And then we want to go ahead now and include. Now this time the include, it's in a folder inside of where the index resides. So in this case, we don't need -- dash to go out of the directory. We need to just stay in the directory. We need to go into the components. So just -- dash, referring to this directory. So the index directory, we want to go into the components. And inside of there, we have something called splash. Okay, so let's go back to our web page, try that out, and you can see that we've got good alignment here. Now, a problem we got here utilizing a container is you can see in this preview that we're trying to build, it has a border at the bottom, and this is a component or a feature of our splash component here. Now, notice that this border goes all the way across, but the initial container that we created is going to be inside of this. It doesn't fit the whole width. So for example, if I were to set a border here, so let's go for border 1 and press refresh. It's not working. So the first port of call is to remember the hard refresh. Now I'm on the Mac, so I'm going to press Shift, Command and R on the Mac, and that's going to refresh or hard refresh the page in case there's some sort of cache problem here with the browser and it's not displaying the up-to-date version of the code. So back in the code, in addition to specifying that we will require a border and also the size of the border in pixels, let's now just specify a color for the border. So border dark. Let's just put the number back here, border 1. So with that in place, let's go back and you can see that when we refresh, you can see nothing happens with border 1. So let's go border 2. And you can see nothing happens with border 2. So if we just use border and refresh, you can see that we then have a nice little border to specify we're going to use a border. And we can then specify border bottom, for example. So we can specify where we want the border, and in addition to that we can then go ahead and specify then the width of the border. So in this case 2 pixels, and you can see that that got slightly thicker. So there's a few different things there. That's pretty much everything we need to know about creating borders. But ultimately you can see that when we apply a border to our container is being restrained to a certain width, and of course we want to now have a border which goes all the way across. So we need to come out of this container here and wrap it up with another set of divs, and that's going to create some sort of outer container for our container, if you like. So let's put that in place. Let's now add the border to that. So div class equals, and then border bottom, we obviously just want the 1, and dark border. So with that in place, let's go back again and have a look, and you can now see we have the border that stretches all the way across. So next up, let's go ahead and see if we can now add some text, and then we can start to think about alignment of that. So let's use some H1 tags. So the H1 to H6 tags, the whole point of these tags ultimately are to help guide the browser. And for example, if you're utilizing, for example, if you're partially sighted and you're utilizing some sort of reader, that gives the software some indication of like what's the highlights of that particular page, what's the main aspects of those pages. So for example, a screen reader can go directly to the H1s first because those are the headings of the page, and that gives the person who may be partially sighted in utilizing a tool such as that a better idea of what's particularly on that page. In addition to that, for search engine optimization, it does tell Google and other search engines, you know, what's the most important thing on that page, and that gives then context to the page. So H1 are the most important, down to H6. So when we're trying to create specific elements on our page, we're trying to utilize these H1 tags to identify like a priority system, if you like, of content that's on our page. So this might be something that we want, a feature of our page which we want users to see instantly or to read instantly. So we give this a H1 tag here, and then this is essentially just metadata H1. Doesn't necessarily mean anything else than that. So let's add a class here. So in addition to font size 1 to 6, we also 1 to 5, we also have the option in Bootstrap to show larger fonts, and this is found in display. So display 1, that's going to show a lot larger font, so we're going to call that Tech Talk with a full stop. Let's give that a go. So we now refresh and you can see we have that in place. Now you can see it's not as large as this, so we probably want to up that a little bit more. Now the reason why that didn't work in actual fact, because I've typed it in incorrectly, display 1. So that should be larger now. There we go. So that's what we're looking for, Tech Talk. So let's just inspect this and right click, inspect. So have a look at the fonts here. Let's go over to the computed here, and you can see that we're using this font family, and that's not the font that we're going to be utilizing. Remember earlier we selected the Barlow font for this. So let's go back now into our code. Let's look for the static. So inside of djblogger, we have static. Inside of there, we have CSS and our main. So inside of here is where we initially placed in the previous tutorial all the fonts in preparation for them to be applied in our application. So what we want to do here is we want to override the fonts that are being provided by us by Bootstrap, and we want to now add our own font. So this font that we're going to be utilizing is going to be Barlow. That's what we're going to be utilizing throughout our application. So let's apply that. Let's go back and see if it makes a change. So we might need to do a hard refresh here. So after I completed the hard refresh, I can now see that the font has changed to Barlow. So I'm now utilizing Barlow font. That's what I want to be using in this application. So one thing you might have noticed, and one of the benefits of utilizing a framework, is that it provides additional features that we may not have thought about. And one of those features is that you can see here that the text is scaling as we move down. So whereas on maybe a laptop or a PC screen, we might have the font quite large, we aren't going to need that large font, for example, when we move down to a mobile phone. It's going to be too large. So you can see this framework will automatically scale our text for us as we move down to the smaller screen size. So now we need to add some text underneath. So let's go ahead and do that. So back here in our application, you're going to need to probably get a little bit more familiarized with the layout. I am a little bit quick sometimes jumping through the different folders and files here, but we're going to go back to the splash.html. If you can find that, and then underneath this h1 here, we're going to then add some more code. Right, so we are going to want to add some text. So we can put this, for example, now we could use a h2 tag, for example. This instance, I'm just going to use a p tag for now, so paragraph tag, and I'm just going to add some text here. So this is going to be no nonsense tutorial. I noticed that the original was spelled incorrectly. No nonsense tutorials, tips, and expertise from writers on tech topics. Okay, so let's go back. Let's take a look. There we go. So we just need to now scale this appropriately. So let's go back to our code. Now what we can do here, if you prefer, is to go to View and Word Wrap, and that will just wrap any long sentences. So apologies, I've changed the view so you can see my tabs now. That makes it probably easier for you to follow. Right, so let's now make some changes. So font size, we're going to change it to 4. We can also change the line height to make it shorter or bigger. So let's change the line height to 1. And we want to add a little bit of color here. So we're going to use text muted. So that's a built-in class in Bootstrap, which is going to allow us to kind of gray out text a little bit to make a contrast between the heading and the text. So let's take a look at that. Oh, not on there, on there. There we go. So that's what we've got currently. Now, one thing that we are going to need to do is change this font weight to 500. Now, I was just looking to see if that is possible. So we have these different options here. Now, notice earlier font weights were expressed in numbers, 400, 500, and so on. So I think what happens here, we've got 400. We probably got bolder font, might be 600. So let's take a look at FW Bolder, because it might not provide 500. So our font that we're utilizing supports 500 weight, which is kind of like an in-between between normal and not so bold. That's not a very good description, but let's go back. Let's take a look. So that's a little bit too bold, right? So that changes our font weight. If I inspect and go down here, I can see that changes it to 700. That doesn't necessarily help. Font bolder and bold. Okay. So let's go back then, and we're going to use FW as a key, and we're going to go back to our main CSS inside of djblogger static CSS main, and now we're going to add our own customization. So I'm going to call this font weight 500. That's the name of the class name, if you like, that we're going to be utilizing, the identifier. And now let's go ahead and change the font weight to 500. So I'm trying to utilize the same kind of terminology as Bootstrap to make things consistent. And there's my override. So now I can go back into my splash here, and let's say font weight 500. Now I could use a name if I preferred to, like Bootstrap does, but I'm just going to use 500. It makes it a little bit easier to identify. Let's go back Let's refresh. Might need to do a hard refresh here. Okay, it doesn't seem as though it picked that up. Sometimes that's the case. Let's go back in font weight. So sometimes that is going to be the case. Let's get rid of the font boulder first because we've declared that. And then let's refresh again. You can see now it works. Now, sometimes when we're trying to override existing Bootstrap classes, we are going to be a little bit more explicit and have to include important. So if you find sometimes, this is not an exact science, apologies, but if you find sometimes you're trying to add some overrides to the Bootstrap CSS, then it doesn't work. Sometimes you need to add the important in order to get that override to work. So in this case we don't, so let's just move that back. Okay, so let's add some features. So you notice that on the preview here, when it gets to a certain size, screen size, you can see it then moves to center and then appears centered, for example, on a mobile view. So you can see that is being changed. In addition to that, you can see that we've restricted the width here of this text. And how we did that is by utilizing the features inside of Bootstrap. So let's have a look at that first. So in the layout here, we've got containers and we have, for example, grid. So what we have here is a grid system in Bootstrap, and it has a maximum of 12. And what we can do is we can take that 12 and we can break that 12 into smaller chunks. So for example, if we wanted to make 2 boxes either side, we could have a column with a 6 size and another column with a 6 size, and that would then make 2 equally sized columns. So here in this case you can see that that isn't necessarily always going to be the case, because you can just specify, for example, columns, and those columns will then be equally spread across the page. So this takes a little bit of understanding, and although I'm not going into the exact details here and giving you an overview, a complete overview of how to set this up, I'll try and guide you through as we work with this. If you do want to read through before we start working with essentially Flexbox, then do go ahead and have a look at a Flexbox tutorial. And just by typing in Flexbox, this link here takes you, for example, to the Mozilla web doc pages, and that will give you a great overview of how this works. So the idea here is that behind the scenes we're using Flexbox. Now Flexbox has a certain language. Now what we're doing here in Bootstrap is Bootstrap's kind of utilizing different terminologies to kind of hook into Flexbox, which is compatible in pretty much all browsers nowadays, which is then going to style our page. So if you want to go back to basics, have a look at Flexbox first, have a look at some of the features that it offers and so on, to get an overview of how to actually create flexible layouts on your page. But ultimately we are talking about layouts here. We're talking about building blocks to create layouts so that we can then present the content within those spaces. We can see from this simple example that we have a setup where we have containers, we have rows, and we have columns. Right, so let's just utilize this. Let's just copy this. Let's go back in. Now, obviously we have a container here already. So let's just paste it there. Let's get rid of the container element. And that leaves us with 3 columns. So let's just work with 2 columns here in a row. And let's go ahead and add our content. So we're going to take our content out and now put it into the first column there. There we go. So that's what we end up with. Just close it down. You can see that we have the outer divs, which is going to include the border. We have the container containing the width of our content. We have a new row. Inside our row, we have 2 columns. Okay, so let's go back to our page. Refresh. And you can see what's happened now is that we have 2 columns. They were equally spaced apart. We'll get rid of the word column here for now. There we go. And then it looks something like we've got here. Right, so with that done, let's go ahead now and add a button, and then we'll start to think about spacing a little bit more. So buttons are relatively easy to work with in Bootstrap. There are some examples. If we go into components and then buttons. So here, let's just make sure we're working on the latest version. That will also be helpful. So here we have some buttons in component and buttons, sorry. You can see that we have different colors that we can work with, as well as changing some other parameters of our button, the background color, text color, the size of the button. We can have large and smaller buttons by default. So really simple to work with. So let's go ahead and I think we're going to, let's take a look. Looks like we're going to change the shape a little bit of it, and we're going to have a solid background. So let's find an example of that. Let's go up here. Let's use the dark. Let's start off with the dark button. So I'm going to copy that. Let's go back in. It's going to go underneath the P tags here. We're going to have a button. So move that in a little bit. Okay. So that should produce a nice button on the page. So now we just need to make some changes. Obviously do text, rounded edges. So let's go back. Right, so the options here then. So we have type button. So we have class button, button dark. So we have the color, and here in this class we have obviously parameters that build the button. Right, so let's go for rounded. There's a whole heap of different rounded options we have. So I'm going to go for rounded pill. So that's going to create the look that we will desire in this case. Okay, and we're going to need some different text here. So in ours we said start reading. Okay, maybe this is a link to the latest post. In addition to that, we are going to want font size 500. So FS 500. Let's use the class we created earlier, a bit of code reuse. And then let's think about the font size. So we're going to use font size 5 in this case. Let's go back and have a look. So it's starting to look like that. I'm trying to sure if that font weight has worked correctly. Oh, don't want to do that. Let's have a look. So this text here, let's take a look at the button. Go into, so we're looking for font weight. So it's 400. So the font weight doesn't look like it's been applied to the button. So this might be a scenario where our font size or font weight, oh, that's why. Okay, apologies. It's FW, isn't it? That's where we went wrong. So refresh, you can see now we have the font weight in place. So you can see here in the original we're trying to work from, there's a little bit more spacing either side. So we can add a little bit of spacing. So there's two types of spacing, is there not? Padding and margins. So if you're new to this, then you ought to look at having a look at understanding padding and margins. So I think there's something in CSS called the box model. So it's well worth having a look at that and just quickly revising and checking out that. So the box model, CSS. So that's going to give you an idea of where padding resides in regards to the content and where margins are in respects to also then the border. Ultimately, there are 4 sides to our shape: top, right, bottom and left. Now here in Bootstrap, they call these different areas slightly different. So here at the top is the top, I think border top. And then we have on the right hand side, I think it's border start. And then we had the border at the bottom, or the padding at the bottom, sorry. And that's padding bottom. And then on the left hand side, this is called padding end or border end or margin end. So top, start, bottom. Let's just double check that if you're not too sure. So let's go down to padding. So let's search the documents of padding, margins and paddings. So that has changed from 4 to 5 if you're used to the previous version. Okay, doesn't look like it's there. Let's try that again. Padding, spacing. Okay, so here we have top. So T for top, B for bottom, start for the left. Sorry, so we're around. Start for left and end is the right. Apologies, I got that mixed up. So start is here, top, end, bottom. So those are rules with Bootstrap. So let's go ahead and apply that. So we're going to add some padding, we want to add some padding to the left and the right. So we don't have to specify left and right or top and bottom. We have the X and the Y axis. So X referring to left and right, Y referring to top and bottom. So we can definitely utilize that here. So we're going to say padding. We want padding. Where do we want padding? In this case, we want padding on the left and right, the X, and then we can specify padding. So let's specify 4. Now that won't go up to 100 here. There's only a few numbers that we can work with here. I think it's 6. So we'll define 4. And there we go. So we now have some padding. So that's pretty much our button sorted. So the next thing is to think about spacing. So what we need to be careful of here when we add some spacing is that when the screen is reduced, the screen size is reduced, we want to make sure that spacing is relevant to that particular screen. So if we set it, for example, spacing 5, when it's up here, when it's down here, we may want a smaller spacing between the top and the bottom of the next element, for example. So if I hover over, you can see the green areas here and the orange areas. So the green referring to padding and the orange areas referring to margins. You can see on the right hand side here, it gives me an overview of the sizes that are also utilized here. So let's see if we can add some padding to our own. Let's start with this column here. So we're going to work with this column. So let's say that, for example, padding, and then we're going to say Y. So that's going to be top and bottom. So let's, for example, say that's going to be 1. So we're going to have a padding of 1. So the higher the number, the more padding. So that's top and bottom padding. Now what we can do here is we can then specify certain sizes where we want it to change. So at certain screen resolutions, we can change it. So for example, we can utilize the built-in breakpoints in Bootstrap. So large, medium, small, etc. So when it gets to a certain size, it would then change to something else. So here we're saying a small screen, we're going to have a padding of 1. And then when we get to a larger screen resolution size, we're then going to be utilizing 5 padding. So let's just refresh. You can now see that we've added some padding here and at the bottom. So when we go back into a smaller screen, when we go below medium, you can see that that then changes. So you can see that T gets closer in the tech talk, that gets closer to the djblogger. Okay, so that looks okay. You can see it's slightly larger. We might want to add some additional padding there, but it's not too bad at the moment. So you can see at the bottom here, potentially we're going to need a little bit more padding. So let's take a look at what we've just done. So we can right click and inspect here. And you can see by hovering over on the right hand side, you can see the green top and bottom now that we've just added. So that's the padding that we've just added to our column. When we define padding, typically in Bootstrap, we can only go up to 5. So if we wanted more padding, we can define this manually within our CSS page here. But what we're trying to do is avoid that. So what I'm looking for now is to add more padding somewhere else. So I can add it in the next element up, for example, and that would add more padding. So for example, if I were to add in our class row here, if I were to add some more padding up on top and bottom and go back, you can see that's going to pretty much double the amount of padding that we have now at the top and bottom. So let's go ahead and inspect again. So you can see now we have padding here, and then we've just applied padding here on the row as well. We are going to remove the padding from the row. I'm going to add it in the container. So I'm going to add a consistent padding of, for example, 5, regardless of the screen size. So let's take a look at that. So you can see that we can have a consistent 5 spacing from the smallest screen size to the largest. So that's what we're looking at the moment. It's starting to look a little bit more like what we're aiming for in terms of size and shape and padding. So let's add some padding between the button now and the text. So we can do this on the text here. We can have padding at the bottom, or we can add padding at the top from the button. So it's completely up to you, but I'm going to do this from the text here. So I'm going to add some padding at the bottom of the text to make a space between the text and the button. So back in the code, I need to find the element that I'm working with. and that's the p tag here. So we just need to specify padding, bottom in this case. Let's go for 4. Let's go back and have a look, and there we go. So maybe we're going to add a little bit larger. So let's go for padding 5 at the bottom, and there we go. Okay, so now we need to think about centering. Right, so remember that when we scale down, eventually it will go central, will be central. Now what we need to do here, now remember what we have here is 2 columns. This doesn't have to be done this way. I'm just approaching it this way in this case. We can actually solve this problem in a slightly different way, but we have 2 columns behind the scene here. Remember, the left and the right column. Now what we're going to do is when it gets to a certain size, for example, this screen width here, we want to change it so the box here, this div here, becomes full width, and then we want to center. So that's what we need to try to achieve here. So we want to scale down, we're going to merge these, or not merge them, we're going to make it into 12, a whole width box element, and then we're going to center the text. So let's give this a go. Right, so here then, first of all, let's just get rid of this column. Okay, let's take a look at what that looks like. Now you can see that straight away the column is going to be utilizing the whole width. Right, so let's specify the size of this column by default, which is going to be 6. So now what we have is 1 column on the left. We haven't specified the right one, but because we specified the size of 1, it's going to take 6 of the 12 blocks, if you like, across. So we now have an element in the middle here that's taken up half the screen, or half the container that it's within. So let's now specify when that changes. So in actual fact, at the smallest width, we want this column size to be 12, take up the whole width. And then when it gets to medium, so col MD, when it gets to the medium size, we want to change that to 6 to take up half. So we refresh here, it's taken up half. If we scale down, when it gets to the medium width breakpoint, it's going to go, you can see there it went full width. Now what we might want to do is change it a little bit earlier. So we take a look at this preview, you can see here it kind of moves a lot earlier, at around about 700 pixels. So just a case of having a look again at the breakpoints. So let's go into the layout breakpoints, see what they specify. So here medium is above 768 and then large is that. Okay, so maybe we want to specify it to break at the large size. Actually, no, I think it's okay. Okay, so here it's broken just here, isn't it? It's around about 700, just there. So I think it's the same as this one. Yeah. Okay, so we're happy with that. We're going to keep that. So what we want to do is align the text center when it does get to this breakpoint. So let's give that a go. So this is one of the tricky things, aligning things center. You'll spend a lot of time trying to remember how to do this and to apply it, because there are multiple ways. What do you want to align? Do you want to align the element, or do you want to align the text, for example, or the content within? So there's different ways of aligning here. So what we need to find here is the actual column, this column element here. And inside of here, we're going to specify text center. Okay, so let's do that first. Let's go back and have a look. You can see that everything is now centered. All the text is centered all the time. Now, obviously, we don't want that. We want to have it left aligned here, if you like, on the larger, and then center aligned in the lower screen resolutions. So let's go back into the code, and we just need to now specify at a larger width. So text MD. So when the text gets to medium, we want to align it to the start. So start is a word that you'll find from Flexbox technology. So that's going to align it on the left-hand side, so start and end. And there we go. So it's now aligned on the left. When it gets to a smaller size, you can see it then gets centered aligned. So that completes the splash screen for now. We might make some changes later, maybe add some more padding and so on. But for now, I think we're ready to move on. Now, if you have had any problems with this, then please check out the code repository. You'll be able to copy and paste the code, of course, and inspect the final code base.